Alright, so get this. America didn't just magically pop up in 1776 like it spawned in a video game lobby. No, this whole thing was way more complicated than that. Think of it like the pilot episode of the longest running reality show ever, America. We're talking about a story that starts way before the Declaration of Independence, before the Constitution, before any of that stuff you see in the history books. This is the origin story, but not like those Marvel movies where everything just works out perfectly. This is more like when you're trying to build something in Minecraft and you keep running into problems, but somehow you make it work anyway. We're going to cover everything from the moment Europeans first showed up on these shores to the point where America became this massive industrial powerhouse. So buckle up, because we're about to go on a wild ride through American history. We'll talk about the OG Americans who were here first, the Europeans who showed up with their God, the whole Columbian Exchange situation that was basically the world's most chaotic DoorDash order. This isn't your typical history lesson where we just memorize dates and names. We're going to make this stuff actually make sense, using analogies that actually matter to you. Think of it like this. If history was a video game, we're about to unlock all the cheat codes and understand how the whole system works. Ready to dive in? Let's start with what was happening in America before Columbus even got lost and ended up here. So before Columbus showed up and started claiming he discovered America, there were already millions of people living here. And I'm not talking about some primitive caveman situation. These were sophisticated societies with complex cultures, trade networks, and cities that would make you do a double take. Let's start with the basics. The first people to arrive in the Americas came across the Bering Strait from Asia at least 10,000 years ago. Think of it like the ultimate migration story. They were basically doing a cross-continental road trip before roads even existed. These Paleo-Indians started as hunter-gatherers, chasing after massive animals like mastodons and ancient bison. It was like living in a real-life Jurassic Park, but with more practical survival skills. Over time, these people figured out something that would change everything: agriculture. And not just any agriculture, they developed what I like to call the ultimate starter pack: maize, beans, and squash. This wasn't just random farming. This was a sophisticated system where these three crops worked together like a perfectly balanced team. The beans would fix nitrogen in the soil, the squash would provide ground cover, and the maize would grow tall and strong. It's like they were playing Minecraft and discovered the perfect farming meta before anyone else. This agricultural revolution led to some seriously impressive civilizations. Take Cahokia, for example. This place was basically ancient New York City before New York City existed. We're talking about a city with thousands of people, massive earth mounds that were basically ancient skyscrapers, and a complex society that would make any modern city planner jealous. No yellow cabs, but way more earth mounds, which honestly might be an improvement. The Mississippian culture that built Cahokia wasn't alone. All across North America, from the Southwest to the Pacific Northwest, indigenous peoples were building complex societies. The ancestral Puebloans in the Southwest were constructing cliff dwellings that would make any modern architect jealous, complete with sophisticated irrigation systems to farm in what was basically a desert. But here's where things get really interesting. These societies had a completely different approach to land ownership than what Europeans would later bring. They treated land like a group Netflix account, everyone shared the password, and the idea of private property was basically foreign to them. Land was something to be shared and sustained, not bought and sold. When Europeans showed up later, they were like, actually, we're changing this to private accounts only, and that would cause problems for centuries to come. These pre-Columbian societies weren't isolated either. They had extensive trade networks that connected them across thousands of miles. Seashells from coastal regions would end up in inland archaeological sites, showing that these people were connected in ways that would surprise most modern Americans. They were sharing ideas, technologies, and cultural practices long before the internet made that kind of thing normal. So when we talk about the discovery of America, we're really talking about the moment when Europeans stumbled into a continent that was already fully occupied and developed. This wasn't some empty wilderness waiting to be tamed. It was a complex, interconnected world of human societies that had been thriving for thousands of years. The success or failure of European colonies would depend heavily on this pre-existing human landscape. The New World was actually an old world to its inhabitants, and that reality would shape everything that happened next. These indigenous societies had already solved many of the problems that Europeans would struggle with: how to farm in different environments, how to organize large communities, how to trade across vast distances. But all of that was about to change dramatically when Columbus showed up in 1492. The collision of these two worlds would create one of the most transformative periods in human history, and it would set the stage for everything that would come after. So why did Europeans suddenly decide to cross the entire Atlantic Ocean? It wasn't just because they were bored or wanted to see what was on the other side. This was a calculated move driven by three powerful forces that historians have traditionally summarized as God, These three motivations would shape the entire course of world history. Let's start with God. This wasn't just about personal religious beliefs. This was about spreading Christianity like it was a viral TikTok challenge. The European nations, especially Spain and Portugal, saw themselves as on a divine mission to convert the entire world to Christianity. This mindset had been building for centuries, starting with the Crusades in the 11th through 13th centuries. Those religious wars weren't just about reclaiming the Holy Lands from Muslim control. They created a militant religious ideology that would last for generations. The legacy of the Crusades was carried forward in what's called the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign by Christian kingdoms to expel Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, which is basically modern-day Spain and Portugal. This wasn't just a military campaign, it cemented a culture of religious intolerance and conquest that would inspire the ambitions of Atlantic colonization. For the strongly Catholic nations, exploration wasn't just a secular enterprise, it was a sacred mission to convert new populations and establish the global dominance of the Church. But let's be real, while God was important, gold was probably the main event. This was basically the ultimate IRL treasure hunt, like Mr. Beast, but bloodier. For centuries, Europeans had been coveting the luxury goods of the East: spices, silk, porcelain, all the stuff that traveled along the slow and costly Silk Road. This trade was largely controlled by Muslim middlemen who collected taxes and kept the location of lucrative sources, like the Spice Islands in modern-day Indonesia, a closely guarded secret. The lure of immense profit pushed European merchants and monarchs to seek a direct water route to Asia that would bypass these intermediaries and break the Muslim monopoly on Eastern trade. But beyond trade routes, there was the tantalizing prospect of finding vast reserves of precious metals. Spain would eventually extract massive amounts of gold and silver from the Americas, making it the richest nation in Europe practically overnight. The potential for cultivating valuable cash crops, such as sugar, on newly discovered lands further fueled this economic ambition. And then there was glory. Back in the 15th and 16th centuries, European nations were in their reputation era, flexing like influencers chasing blue check marks. The period was marked by intense political consolidation, as monarchs sought to centralize power and expand their influence. Building a colonial empire was the primary means of demonstrating national strength, gaining strategic military advantages, and achieving global recognition. Nations like Spain, Portugal, France, and England were all competing with each other to claim new territories, establish trade outposts, and project their power across the oceans. The acquisition of colonies was a key component of mercantilism, an economic theory that held that a nation's wealth and power were best served by increasing exports and accumulating precious metals. In this competitive environment, the glory of the nation and its monarch was inextricably linked to the success of its explorers and the expansion of its overseas empire. But here's the thing, none of this would have been possible without some serious technological innovations. The Caravel, a small but fast ship, made long-distance voyages possible. The astrolabe and compass allowed navigators to figure out where they were going without getting completely lost. These technological advances enabled the ambitions of God, gold, and glory to be realized on a global scale. So when Columbus set sail in 1492, he wasn't just some random guy who got lost at sea. He was the product of centuries of religious zeal, economic ambition, and national pride. The collision of these three forces would create one of the most transformative periods in human history, setting the stage for the modern world as we know it. The European voyages of exploration would fundamentally reshape global trade, politics, and culture. They would create new economic systems, new political structures, and new social hierarchies that would last for centuries. The world would never be the same after these three motivations. God, gold, and glory propelled European nations across the Atlantic and set in motion the collision of worlds that would reshape everything. Alright, so Columbus shows up in 1492, and what happens next is basically the world's most chaotic DoorDash order. The Columbian Exchange wasn't just a simple trade of goods between the Old World and the New World. It was a complete biological and economic upheaval that created the world's first truly global system. And, let me tell you, the consequences were absolutely wild. The most immediate and devastating impact was the introduction of Old World diseases to the Americas. We're talking about smallpox, measles, and influenza, the OG pandemic, no Zoom school, just mass devastation. These were diseases that European populations had developed some immunity to over centuries, but they were entirely new to the Western Hemisphere. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no natural defenses against these diseases, and the result was catastrophic. Entire populations were wiped out in what historians call a demographic collapse. Between 1492 and 1650, the Native American population decreased rapidly, And this wasn't just a tragic loss of human life, it was a crucial factor in the relative ease of European conquest and colonization. The depopulation of the Americas created a power vacuum and a severe labor shortage that Europeans would struggle to fill. But here's where things get really interesting. The Columbian Exchange had a dramatically different effect on the Old World. The introduction of nutrient-rich American crops, most notably potatoes and maize, revolutionized agriculture and diets in Europe, Africa, and Asia. These crops were like the ultimate side quest items that fueled a European population glow-up. They could be grown in soils unsuitable for traditional Old World staples and produced higher yields, leading to a more abundant and reliable food supply. The potato, for example, became a staple food in places like Ireland and is credited with contributing to an estimated 25% of the population growth in Afro-Eurasia between 1700 and 1900. This unprecedented population boom in the Old World provided a surplus of people, many of whom would migrate to the now depopulated Americas in the centuries that followed. It's like the game gave Europe a massive population buff, while America got hit with a devastating debuff. Economically, the Columbian Exchange created new global trade networks and fundamentally altered the world's economies. The introduction of European livestock, such as horses, cattle, and pigs, transformed American ecosystems and Native American societies. The horse, in particular, was a game changer. Native Americans went from walking everywhere to full GTA horse mode. This revolutionized transportation, hunting, and warfare for many indigenous groups, especially on the Great Plains. The establishment of vast plantations in the Americas to cultivate cash crops like sugarcane and tobacco became a cornerstone of the colonial economy and generated immense wealth for European powers. These plantations relied on the exploitative labor of enslaved Africans, creating a system that would become one of the most brutal and profitable enterprises in human history. This influx of new commodities and wealth from the Americas into Europe helped to fuel the economic shift from feudalism toward capitalism. The interconnected cycle was wild. Disease led to depopulation, creating a demand for forced labor to produce new global commodities, which in turn enriched a growing European population. It wasn't a planned outcome, but a cascading series of consequences that established the economic and demographic foundations of the modern Atlantic world. The Columbian Exchange established new hierarchies of power based on immunological advantage and control of new commodities. Europe became the center of this new global system, Africa became a source of forced labor, and the Americas became a source of land and raw materials. This wasn't just a trade, it was a complete restructuring of the world's biological and economic systems. So when we talk about the Columbian Exchange, we're really talking about the moment when the world became truly interconnected for the first time. It wasn't always pretty, and it certainly wasn't fair, but it created the foundation for the modern world as we know it. The exchange of plants, animals, diseases, technologies, peoples, and ideas between the Old World and the New World would shape human history for centuries to come. The Columbian Exchange was the ultimate example of unintended consequences. What started as a simple desire to find new trade routes ended up creating a completely new world order. It's like when you're playing a video game and you unlock a new feature that completely changes how the game works, except in this case the game was real life, and the consequences were felt by millions of people across multiple continents. So now that we understand why Europeans showed up and what happened when they did, let's talk about how they actually went about colonizing the Americas. Because here's the thing, the European colonization of the Americas wasn't some monolithic enterprise where everyone did the same thing. The major powers, Spain, France, the Netherlands, and England, each developed completely different colonial models shaped by their national goals, economic priorities, and how they chose to interact with indigenous populations. Let's start with the Spanish, because they were basically the villain DLC of colonization. As the first Europeans to establish a large-scale empire in the Americas, they pursued a model of direct extraction and religious conversion. Their primary goals were to find and exploit precious metals like gold and silver, and to convert Native Americans to Catholicism. This wasn't subtle. They were here to take what they wanted and convert who they could. To achieve this, Spain established a highly centralized and bureaucratic colonial administration. A key institution was the encomienda system, which granted Spanish colonists the right to demand tribute and forced labor from indigenous communities. It was effectively a form of slavery, just with a fancy name. This system, combined with the devastating impact of European diseases, led to the brutal exploitation and demographic collapse of native populations. Socially, Spanish colonization created a rigid, hierarchical society with a complex racial caste system called castas. Europeans were at the top, followed by people of mixed heritage called mestizos, with Native Americans and enslaved Africans at the bottom. The Spanish model was most extensively applied in regions that were already densely populated and had highly developed pre-colonial societies, like the Aztec and Inca empires, because this provided a ready source of labor to exploit. In contrast, the French and Dutch models were primarily commercial in nature, centered on the lucrative fur trade. Think of them as collab YouTubers. They needed native allies to get that sweet fur trade revenue, who sought to conquer and subjugate large native populations. The French and Dutch depended on Native Americans as essential partners in the fur trade. This economic reality fostered more cooperative and interdependent relationships. French and Dutch traders often formed military alliances with indigenous groups, supplied them with European goods like firearms. Consequently, French and Dutch settlements, such as Quebec and New Amsterdam, which would later become New York, were generally smaller, more sparsely populated, and more focused on trade than on large-scale agriculture. While French Jesuit missionaries did attempt to convert Native Americans to Catholicism, their approach was often less coercive than that of the Spanish. The Dutch, known for their commercial prowess, established New Netherland as a diverse, tolerant trading hub that welcomed a variety of European immigrants and even allowed Jewish settlers. It was basically the most progressive of the colonial models, which isn't saying much given the time period. The English model of colonization differed significantly from the others, primarily in its emphasis on large-scale settlement and agriculture. English colonization was driven not just by merchants and soldiers, but by thousands of men, women, and families seeking economic opportunity or religious freedom. This demographic pattern meant that the English established permanent, populous, and land-hungry agricultural communities. This focus on acquiring land for farming inevitably brought them into direct and sustained conflict with Native American populations. The English generally sought to displace indigenous peoples from their lands rather than incorporate them into colonial society as laborers like the Spanish or trade with them as partners like the French and Dutch. This led to a pattern of warfare and removal that characterized English-Indian relations. While the English also sought wealth, they didn't find the vast gold and silver deposits the Spanish had. Instead, their economic success came from agriculture, particularly the cultivation of tobacco in the Chesapeake region, which created a voracious demand for both land and labor. This need for labor would eventually lead to the development of the transatlantic slave trade and the establishment of chattel slavery in the English colonies. So when we look at these three different models of colonization, we can see how they created vastly different societies in the New World. The Spanish created a hierarchical, extractive society based on forced labor and religious conversion. The French and Dutch created commercial societies based on trade and cooperation with indigenous peoples. The English created agricultural societies based on settlement and displacement of indigenous peoples. These different approaches would have profound consequences for the future development of the Americas. The Spanish model would create the foundation for modern Latin America with its complex racial hierarchies and extractive economies. The French and Dutch models would influence the development of Canada and parts of the United States, particularly in terms of their more cooperative relationships with indigenous peoples. The English model would become the foundation for the United States, with its emphasis on private property, individual rights, and westward expansion. The legacy of these different colonial models can still be seen today in the political, economic, and social structures of the Americas. Understanding these differences is crucial for understanding why the Americas developed the way they did and why different regions have such different histories and cultures. Alright, so now that we understand the different approaches to colonization, let's talk about how the English colonies in North America actually developed. Because here's the thing, even though all the English colonies were under the nominal control of the British Crown, they evolved into three completely distinct regions, each with its own unique social. These differences weren't accidental. They were shaped by a combination of factors including the motivations of their founders, geography and climate, and the composition of their settler populations. Let's start with the New England colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire. These were founded primarily by Puritans and separatists, seeking to create communities based on their religious beliefs, free from the perceived corruption of the Church of England. Basically, they said, let's make a group project with no fun allowed. This religious motivation profoundly shaped New England society in ways that would last for generations. Life in New England was centered around tight-knit, religiously homogeneous towns. The institutional framework of governance was the town meeting. Property holders could vote on local matters, which reflected the Puritan belief in a sacred agreement between God and his people. This was basically direct democracy before direct democracy was cool, but only if you were a dude who owned property and went to the right church. Socially, New England was characterized by the migration of families, resulting in a relatively balanced gender ratio and a high rate of natural population growth. There was a strong emphasis on education, primarily to ensure literacy for reading the Bible, which led to the founding of institutions like Harvard College. Economically, the region's rocky soil and cold climate made large-scale plantation agriculture impractical. Instead, New England developed a mixed economy based on small subsistence farms, fishing, lumber, shipbuilding, and maritime trade. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, were the most ethnically and religiously diverse of the three. Think of them as diverse. Like a high school cafeteria, every squad had a table. They attracted a wide range of settlers from different European nations, including the English, Dutch, Swedes, and Germans, and were home to numerous religious groups such as Quakers, Mennonites, Lutherans, and Presbyterians. This pluralism, particularly in Pennsylvania under the guidance of its Quaker founder William Penn, fostered an institutional climate of religious tolerance that was unusual for the era. Socially, the middle colonies were more cosmopolitan and varied than New England. Economically, the region benefited from fertile soil and a temperate climate, earning it the nickname the breadbasket colonies for its large exports of wheat and other grains. The economy was a blend of prosperous family farms and a thriving commercial sector centered on port cities like Philadelphia and New York, which became major hubs for trade and industry. These cities would eventually become the economic powerhouses of colonial America, setting the stage for the urban development that would characterize the United States in the centuries to come. The southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, were founded primarily for economic gain rather than religious freedom. These were massive plantations, slavery, and elite families who thought they were main characters. The region's warm climate and rich soil were ideal for large-scale agriculture, leading to the development of a plantation-based economy centered on the cultivation of labor-intensive cash crops like tobacco. This economic system created a hierarchical social structure dominated by a wealthy elite class of large plantation owners who held significant political and economic power. The vast majority of the population consisted of small yeoman farmers, a large population of enslaved Africans who formed the backbone of the plantation labor force. Politically, while early representative institutions like the Virginia House of Burgesses were established, power was largely concentrated in the hands of the wealthy planter class. But here's where things get really interesting. During the 18th century, two major intellectual and religious movements swept through the American colonies, profoundly shaping their social and political landscape: the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. These movements would plant the seeds of a distinct American identity and lay the groundwork for the revolution to come. The Enlightenment was basically colonial leaders in their STEM major era. This international intellectual movement emphasized reason, science, and individual liberty, and it had a powerful influence on the colonial elite. Thinkers like John Locke articulated revolutionary ideas about natural rights, the rights to life, liberty, and property, and the concept of a social contract, which held that governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. These principles were eagerly absorbed by colonial leaders such as Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, who came to believe that societies could and should establish good government through reflection and choice, rather than relying on the accident and force of monarchy and inherited aristocracy. The Enlightenment provided a rational, secular vocabulary for challenging the authority of the British Crown and Parliament, and for envisioning a new form of republican government based on popular sovereignty. At the same time, the Great Awakening was everyone else in their hype church concert era. This was a series of religious revivals that swept the colonies from the 1730s to the 1760s. Charismatic preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards rejected the cold formalism of established churches and preached a message of personal, emotional salvation. They emphasized an individual's direct relationship with God, empowering ordinary people to challenge the authority of established ministers and church hierarchies. This revivalist fervor cut across colonial and class lines, creating one of the first truly shared American experiences. The Great Awakening led to the rise of new, more democratic Protestant denominations, such as Baptists and Methodists, and fostered a spirit of religious pluralism and individualism. It was basically the moment when religion became more personal and less institutional, which would have profound implications for American society. These two movements, one celebrating reason and the other emotion, paradoxically worked in concert to weaken traditional hierarchies and empower the individual. The Enlightenment provided colonial leaders with the political philosophy to question the authority of the king, while the Great Awakening provided the general populace with a parallel experience of questioning the authority of the established church. This dual challenge, operating on different social and intellectual levels, created a colonial culture uniquely prepared to resist centralized control. This growing sense of autonomy was nurtured by the political reality of colonial governance. For much of the 17th and 18th centuries, Britain governed its North American colonies with a policy of salutary neglect. Initiated by Prime Minister Robert Walpole, this unofficial policy involved the lax enforcement of parliamentary laws, particularly the Navigation Acts that regulated colonial trade. As long as the colonies remained loyal and contributed to Britain's economic prosperity, the Crown allowed them a significant degree of self-government. This freedom enabled the colonies to develop their own robust political institutions, such as town meetings in New England and powerful colonial assemblies in every colony, which controlled local legislation and the salaries of royal governors. This long period of de facto independence allowed the colonists to forge a distinct American identity and accustom them to managing their own affairs. When Britain abruptly ended this policy after 1763 and attempted to reassert imperial control, it set a direct course for conflict and revolution. The colonists had gotten used to running their own show, and they weren't about to give that up without a fight. So when we look at the colonial regions, we can see how they created the foundation for the different regional cultures that would characterize the United States. New England's emphasis on education, religion, and community would influence the development of American democracy and social reform movements. The Middle Colony's diversity and tolerance would become a model for American pluralism and immigration policy. The South's plantation economy and hierarchical society would create the sectional tensions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. These regional differences weren't just historical curiosities, they were the building blocks of American society, and they would shape the nation's development for centuries to come. Alright, so now that we understand how the colonial regions developed, let's talk about one of the most crucial aspects of colonial society, how they got people to do the work. Because, here's the thing, the economic development of the British American colonies was predicated on the availability of a vast and exploitable labor force. From the temporary servitude of Europeans to the permanent, was a critical institutional and social development that profoundly shaped the character of the colonies. Let's start with the early solution to the colonies' insatiable need for labor, indentured servitude. In the early 17th century, this was the primary way to get people to work in the colonies, which had roots in English labor practices, involved individuals signing a contract, by which they agreed to work for a master for a fixed period, in exchange for passage to America. Upon completion of their service, indentured servants were granted their freedom, and, in some cases, freedom dues, which might include land, tools, or money. This system was particularly prevalent in the tobacco-producing colonies of Virginia and Maryland, where the demand for labor was highest. The Virginia Company of London further incentivized this practice through the creation of the headright system in 1608, which awarded 50 acres of land to any colonist who paid for the passage of a new immigrant to the colony. This allowed successful planters to acquire both land and labor simultaneously, fueling the expansion of the tobacco economy. For many impoverished Europeans, indentured servitude offered a path to economic opportunity and land ownership that was unattainable in their home countries. It was basically a high-stakes gamble. Work like a dog for a few years, and maybe you'd end up with your own farm and a shot at the American dream. However, by the late 17th century, the colonial labor system began a dramatic and fateful shift away from indentured servitude and toward chattel slavery. Several factors drove this transition, and the consequences would be devastating. The improving economic conditions in England led to a decline in the number of people willing to sign indentures. Colonial planters also grew wary of the system of temporary servitude because freed servants demanded land, creating social and political tensions. This dynamic exploded in 1676 with Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, where a coalition of former indentured servants and other landless men rose up against the colonial government. This rebellion instilled a deep fear among the planter elite of a large, restive class of landless white men and made a more permanent, controllable labor force seem more appealing. It was basically the moment when the ruling class realized that temporary servitude was creating a dangerous underclass that could threaten their power. Enslaved Africans provided this alternative. Unlike indentured servants, their bondage was for life, and, critically, it was inheritable, meaning the children of enslaved mothers were also born into slavery. This created a self-perpetuating labor force that would grow over time rather than constantly needing replacement. The development of the transatlantic slave trade made enslaved Africans more readily available, and colonial legislatures began to codify the institution of chattel slavery into law. These slave codes stripped Africans of their basic human rights, defined them as property, and established a system of bondage based explicitly on race. While slavery existed in all the colonies, it became the economic engine of the South, where the plantation economy's demand for a large, stable, and exploitable workforce was greatest. This transition institutionalized a system of racial hierarchy and economic exploitation that would become the central conflict in American history. The shift from indentured servitude to chattel slavery wasn't just an economic change, it was a fundamental transformation of American society. Indentured servitude, while exploitative, was temporary and offered the possibility of upward mobility. Chattel slavery was permanent, hereditary, and based on race, creating a system of oppression that would last for generations. This system would have profound implications for the development of American society. It would create the economic foundation for the South's plantation economy, but it would also create the moral and political divisions that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The legacy of this labor system would shape American race relations for centuries to come. So when we talk about colonial labor systems, we're really talking about the foundation of American capitalism and the origins of American racism. The transition from indentured servitude to chattel slavery wasn't just a change in how people worked. It was a change in how people thought about human beings and their value. It was the moment when America began to develop the racial hierarchies that would characterize its society for generations to come. This history is crucial for understanding not just how the colonies developed, but how the United States would develop. The labor systems of the colonial period created the economic and social foundations that would shape the nation's development for centuries to come. They would create the wealth that would make America powerful, but they would also create the divisions that would threaten to tear it apart. Alright, so now that we understand how the colonies developed and how they were organized, let's talk about how everything went sideways and led to the American Revolution. Because here's the thing, the conclusion of the French and Indian War in 1763 marked a pivotal turning point in the relationship between Great Britain and its North American colonies. A decisive victory for the British left the empire with enormous territorial gains, but also with a staggering national debt and the new administrative challenge of governing vast frontier lands. To manage these new responsibilities and raise revenue, the British government abandoned its long-standing policy of salutary neglect and began to assert more direct political and economic control over the colonies. This sudden shift caught the colonists, who had grown accustomed to a high degree of autonomy, completely off guard. It was like when your parents suddenly decide to start monitoring your phone after years of letting you do whatever you want. The shock and outrage were real. The new imperial policy manifested in a series of parliamentary acts designed to extract revenue from the colonies and regulate their affairs. The Sugar Act of 1764 was one of the first such measures. While it lowered the tax on molasses from the French West Indies, it also strengthened enforcement mechanisms, signaling that its primary purpose was to raise revenue, not merely regulate trade. Colonists protested, arguing that this was a form of taxation without their consent, as they had no elected representatives in Parliament. This principle became the rallying cry, no taxation without representation, basically the 18th century equivalent of raging in the group chat because admin muted you. You can't just tax us without asking us first. And the British were like, the first direct tax levied on the American colonies. This act required that a tax stamp be affixed to all printed materials, from legal documents and newspapers to playing cards. It was like paying for memes with watermarks, but mandatory. The response was swift and widespread. Colonial assemblies sent petitions of protest. Delegates from 9 colonies convened the Stamp Act Congress, which issued a Declaration of Rights asserting that only their own legislatures could tax them. On the ground, popular resistance grew, led by groups like the Sons of Liberty, who organized boycotts of British goods and used intimidation to force stamp distributors to resign. Faced with economic pressure from British merchants hurt by the boycotts, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1760 but simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its full authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It was basically Britain saying, we can do whatever we want. In 1767, Parliament tried again with the Townshend Acts, which imposed duties on imported goods such as glass. The revenue from these taxes was designated to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges, a move the colonists saw as a direct attack on the power of their assemblies, which had traditionally controlled the purse strings. The colonies renewed their non-importation agreements, organized as the Daughters of Liberty, playing a crucial role by promoting the use of homespun cloth and boycotting British tea. The British sent troops to Boston to enforce the acts, heightening tensions and leading to the Boston Massacre in 1770. This wasn't just a random act of violence, it was the culmination of years of growing tension between British soldiers and colonial civilians. The presence of British troops in Boston, combined with the economic pressure of the Townshend Acts, created a volatile situation that eventually exploded. The final catalyst came after the Boston Tea Party in 1773. In retaliation, Parliament passed a series of punitive measures in 1774, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. These acts closed the port of Boston, altered the Massachusetts Charter to reduce the power of its representative government, and expanded the Quartering Act. Rather than isolating Massachusetts as intended, these harsh measures unified the colonies in opposition in a critical institutional innovation. The Committees of Correspondence, which had been established to share information and coordinate resistance, spread the news of the acts and called for a united response. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia to orchestrate a collective resistance to British tyranny, marking a decisive step on the road to independence. So, when we talk about the road to revolution, we're really talking about a fundamental shift in how the British Empire governed its colonies. The policy of salutary neglect had allowed the colonies to develop their own political institutions and sense of identity. When Britain suddenly tried to reassert control, it created a crisis that the colonists weren't willing to accept. The revolution wasn't inevitable, but it was made much more likely by Britain's failure to understand how much the colonies had changed during the period of neglect. The colonists had gotten used to running their own affairs, and they weren't about to give that up without a fight. The road to revolution was paved with a series of British missteps and colonial resistance, each one bringing the colonies closer to the breaking point. This period also shows us how political resistance can evolve from peaceful protest to armed conflict. The colonists started with petitions and boycotts, but as British repression increased, they moved toward more radical forms of resistance. The Committees of Correspondence were crucial in this process, allowing the colonies to coordinate their resistance and develop a sense of unity that would be essential for the revolution to succeed. So, when we look at the road to revolution, we can see how a series of policy changes and colonial responses created a crisis that would eventually lead to war. It wasn't just about taxes, it was about power, autonomy, and the right to govern themselves. The colonists had developed a distinct American identity during the period of salutary neglect, and they weren't willing to give that up when Britain tried to take it away. Alright, so now that we understand how the colonies got to the breaking point, let's talk about what happened when the shooting actually started. Because, here's the thing, the American War for Independence was more than just a military conflict. It was a revolution in political thought. Its success depended on a powerful ideological foundation, resilience on the battlefield, and crucial international support. The ideological core of the revolution was articulated in the Declaration of Independence, adopted by the Second Continental Congress on July 4, 1776. Primarily authored by Thomas Jefferson, the document was a masterwork of Enlightenment philosophy, drawing heavily on John Locke's theory of the social contract. It began not with a specific grievance, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Declaration argued that governments are instituted to secure these rights and derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. It then presented a long list of grievances against King George III, portraying him as a tyrant who had violated the social contract and thus forfeited his right to rule the colonies. This document transformed a dispute over taxes and representation into a universal struggle for liberty, providing a powerful moral and philosophical justification for independence. The military conflict began in earnest with the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord in April 1775. This was basically the opening boss fight of the American Revolution. The Continental Army, led by George Washington, faced the formidable challenge of confronting the most powerful military force in the world. The early years of the war were marked by significant hardships and defeats, including the loss of New York City and the brutal winter encampment at Valley Forge. Speaking of Valley Forge, Washington was literally grinding XP in survival mode during that winter. The Continental Army faced starvation, disease, and freezing temperatures, but somehow they managed to survive and emerge stronger. This period of suffering actually helped forge the Army into a more disciplined and effective fighting force. A critical turning point came in October 1777 with the American victory at the Battle of Saratoga. This was the clutch win that unlocked the France DLC. This decisive victory convinced France that the American cause was viable, leading to a formal alliance in 1778. Without French support, the American Revolution would have been much more difficult, if not impossible, to win. The French alliance was indispensable to the American victory. France provided essential financial aid, military supplies, experienced officers, and, most critically, its powerful navy. The French fleet's blockade of the Chesapeake Bay was instrumental in trapping the British Army under Lord Cornwallis at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. This was the final raid boss, with France's navy serving as the OP support character that made victory possible. The subsequent surrender of Cornwallis's army effectively ended major military operations and secured American independence. It was like finally beating the final boss after hours of grinding and multiple failed attempts. The victory at Yorktown wasn't just a military triumph. It was the culmination of years of struggle and sacrifice. The war effort was sustained by a diverse coalition of people who all had different motivations and goals. Women played crucial roles on the home front, organizing boycotts and fundraising drives. Without their contributions, the war effort would have collapsed. African Americans, both free and enslaved, fought on both sides of the conflict. Thousands served in the Continental Army, often in integrated units, in the hope that the Revolution's ideals of liberty would be extended to them. Many others sought freedom by joining the British, who promised emancipation to those who fought for the crown. For African Americans, the war for independence was a complex struggle with varied motivations and profoundly different outcomes. Native American tribes also found themselves caught in the conflict, with most siding with the British, whom they viewed as a more reliable partner in protecting their lands from the relentless westward expansion of American settlers. For these diverse groups, the war for independence was a complex struggle with varied motivations and profoundly different outcomes. The war had a profound impact on the home front as well. Both sides resorted to conscription to fill their armies. The Continental Congress struggled to raise money and supplies, leading to inflation and economic hardship. The British blockade of American ports created shortages of essential goods, while the presence of British troops in American cities created social tensions and violence. The war also created new opportunities for women and African Americans to challenge traditional social hierarchies. Women took on new roles in the absence of men, while some African Americans used the rhetoric of liberty to argue for their own freedom. These changes weren't always permanent, but they showed how war could create opportunities for social change. So when we talk about the war for independence, we're really talking about a complex conflict that involved much more than just military battles. It was a war of ideas, a war of survival, and a war that would reshape the world. The victory at Yorktown secured American independence, but it also set the stage for the challenges that would face the new nation. The war showed that the American colonies could work together to achieve a common goal, but it also revealed the divisions and tensions that would characterize American society for generations to come. The ideals of liberty and equality that were articulated in the Declaration of Independence would inspire people around the world, but they would also create expectations that the new nation would struggle to fulfill. The war for independence was the moment when America became a nation, but it was also the moment when the challenges of nation building became apparent. The victory at Yorktown was just the beginning of a much longer and more complex process of creating a stable and effective government for the new United States. Alright, so now that we understand how the colonies won their independence, let's talk about the real challenge, trying to figure out how to actually govern this new nation. Because here's the thing, victory in the Revolutionary War secured independence, but it also presented the new United States with the formidable challenge of creating a stable and effective government. The first attempt, the Articles of Confederation, reflected the deep-seated fear of centralized power that had fueled the Revolution, established a firm league of friendship among the states, creating a weak national government with a unicameral Congress in which each state had one vote. Think of it as the trial version of government with no premium features. The central government under the Articles lacked fundamental powers. It could not levy taxes, regulate interstate or foreign commerce, or raise a standing army. To fund its operations, it had to request money from the states, which were often unwilling to comply, leaving the national government perpetually underfunded and unable to pay its war debts. Furthermore, its inability to regulate trade hindered economic recovery and allowed foreign powers like Britain and Spain to exploit the disunity among the states. It was like trying to run a country with one hand tied behind your back and no money in the bank. The weaknesses of the Articles became glaringly apparent in the mid-1780s. The economic turmoil of the post-war period, combined with high state taxes and debt, fell heavily on farmers. In the winter of 1786-87, this discontent erupted into Shays' Rebellion, an armed uprising of indebted farmers in western Massachusetts led by Revolutionary War veteran Daniel Shays. The rebels shut down courts to prevent foreclosures on their farms. This was basically farmers saying, "This update sucks, uninstall." The national government was powerless to intervene, and the rebellion had to be suppressed by a privately funded militia. This event shocked the nation's elite and served as a powerful catalyst, convincing leaders like George Washington and James Madison that the Articles were inadequate and that a stronger national government was necessary to ensure domestic order and the survival of the Republic. In response, delegates from 12 states convened in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 for the Constitutional Convention. Initially tasked with revising the Articles, the delegates quickly decided to draft an entirely new framework of government. This was basically a group chat rename. Virginia Plan versus New Jersey Plan ended with the Great Compromise. The convention was marked by intense debates over the structure and powers of the new government. A central conflict arose between large and small states over the issue of representation in the national legislature. The large states favored the Virginia Plan, which proposed proportional representation based on population, while the small states supported the New Jersey Plan, which called for equal representation for each state. The dispute was resolved by the Great Compromise, or Connecticut Compromise, which created a bicameral Congress, the House of Representatives, with proportional representation, with equal representation, 2 senators per state. This was like creating a 2-tier system where everyone gets a voice, but some voices are louder than others. The divisive issue of slavery also required a series of difficult compromises. Southern delegates insisted that enslaved people be counted for the purpose of representation, while Northern delegates argued they should be counted for taxation. The result was the 3/5 Compromise, which stipulated that 3/5 of the enslaved population would be counted for both representation in the House and for direct taxation. Another compromise protected the transatlantic slave trade from congressional prohibition for at least 20 years. The delegates also debated the nature of the executive branch, ultimately creating a single president elected not by popular vote, but by an electoral college. This system was designed to balance the influence of different states and serve as a check on direct democracy, but is basically like a weird group project grading system no one asked for, but we're still stuck with. The resulting Constitution established a government built on 3 core institutional principles. Federalism divided power between the national government and the state governments. Separation of powers distributed the national government's authority among 3 distinct branches: the legislative, Congress, the executive president, and the judicial, Supreme Court. Finally, a system of checks and balances was created, giving each branch the means to limit the power of the other 2. For example, the president's power to veto legislation passed by Congress, and Congress's power to impeach the president. This intricate framework was designed to create a government strong enough to be effective, yet constrained enough to protect liberty. The Constitution was a remarkable achievement, but it was also a product of compromise and political necessity. The delegates had to balance the need for a strong national government with the fear of tyranny that had fueled the revolution. They had to find ways to accommodate the different interests and concerns of the various states and regions. The ratification process was also contentious, with fierce debates between Federalists, who supported the Constitution, and Anti-Federalists, who feared it created a government that was too powerful. The Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, authored a series of essays known as the Federalist Papers to explain and defend the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists' most potent argument was the Constitution's lack of a Bill of Rights to protect fundamental freedoms. The debate was ultimately resolved when Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights as the first order of business for the new Congress. This compromise secured ratification. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution, guaranteeing freedoms of speech. So when we talk about the new government experiments, we're really talking about the process of trial and error that led to the creation of the American constitutional system. The Articles of Confederation showed what didn't work, while the Constitution created a framework that, while not perfect, has proven remarkably durable and adaptable. The Constitution was a product of its time, reflecting the concerns and compromises of the late 18th century. But it also created a system of government that could evolve and adapt to changing circumstances. The process of creating the new government showed that the American people were capable of working together to solve complex problems, even when they had different interests and concerns. This period also established many of the precedents and traditions that would characterize American government for generations to come. The Constitutional Convention showed how compromise and negotiation could be used to resolve political conflicts, while the ratification process demonstrated the importance of public debate and participation in the political process. The new government experiments were a crucial step in the development of American democracy. They showed that it was possible to create a government that was both strong and free, and they established the institutional framework that would allow the United States to grow and prosper in the centuries to come. Alright, so now that we understand how the Constitution was created and ratified, let's talk about what happened when the new government actually started operating. Because here's the thing, the creation of the Constitution in 1787 did not end the debate over the nature of American government, it merely shifted it to a new arena. The process of ratification and the challenges of the first decade under the new government exposed deep ideological divisions that led to the formation of the nation's first political parties. It's like when you finally finish building your dream house, but then realize you have to figure out how to actually live in it with your family, who all have different ideas about how things should work. The campaign for ratification pitted 2 opposing groups against each other. The Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, supported the Constitution and advocated for a strong, centralized national government. To make their case, They authored a series of 85 essays known as the Federalist Papers, which were published in New York newspapers. These essays provided a detailed analysis of the Constitution, arguing that its system of checks and balances and separation of powers would prevent tyranny, and that a strong union was necessary to control the violence of faction. Opposing them were the Anti-Federalists, who feared that the new Constitution created a national government that was too powerful and would threaten individual liberties and the sovereignty of the states. Their most potent argument was the Constitution's lack of a Bill of Rights to protect fundamental freedoms. The debate was ultimately resolved when Federalists promised to add a Bill of Rights as the first order of business for the new Congress. This compromise secured ratification, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, guaranteeing freedoms of speech. George Washington was unanimously elected as the first president in 1789, and his leadership was crucial in establishing the legitimacy of the new government. He set numerous important precedents, including the creation of a cabinet of advisors, the assertion of the president's role in foreign policy, a tradition that would last until the 20th century. Washington was basically the OG president who set the standard for everyone who came after. The central conflicts of Washington's administration revolved around the ambitious economic program of his Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was basically the finance bro of early America, dropping mixtape-length essays about economics and government. His financial plan aimed to establish the nation's credit and create a powerful, integrated national economy. Its key components were the federal assumption of state debts incurred during the Revolution, the creation of a national bank, the Bank of the United States. This plan was deeply divisive. It favored commercial and financial interests, who envisioned an agrarian republic of independent yeoman farmers and feared that Hamilton's system would create a corrupt, centralized power structure similar to Britain's. Jefferson was basically a farm corps influencer, hating on banks and advocating for a simpler, more rural way of life. The federal government's power was tested in 1794 when farmers in western Pennsylvania rose up in the Whiskey Rebellion to protest a federal excise tax on distilled spirits. This was basically an 1800s version of a bar crawl protest. Farmers refused to pay alcohol tax and took up arms to make their point. Washington's decisive action in leading a militia to suppress the rebellion demonstrated the new government's will and ability to enforce its laws. These fundamental disagreements over economic policy, the proper role of government, and foreign affairs, particularly the French Revolution, led to the formation of the first organized political parties. Hamilton's supporters became known as the Federalist Party, while Jefferson and Madison's opposition coalition formed the Democratic-Republican Party. This development was not an unforeseen accident, but the logical institutional outcome of two deeply rooted, competing ideologies about the nation's economic, social, and political future. The partisan conflict intensified under Washington's successor, John Adams. His presidency was dominated by a quasi-war with France, which led the Federalist-controlled Congress to pass the controversial Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. These laws raised residency requirements for citizenship, authorized the president to deport dangerous aliens, made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government. The acts were widely seen as a partisan tool to suppress dissent and silence the Democratic-Republican press, articulated in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. The backlash against these acts contributed to a sweeping Democratic-Republican victory in the election of 1800. The election of Thomas Jefferson, dubbed the Revolution of 1800, was a landmark event, marking the first peaceful transfer of executive power from one opposing party to another and confirming the viability of the young republic's political system. This was a crucial test of American democracy. Could power be transferred peacefully between opposing political parties? The answer was yes, and it established a precedent that would become one of the defining characteristics of American democracy. The Federalist era was a period of intense political conflict and institutional development. The new government had to prove that it could function effectively while protecting individual liberties. The formation of political parties showed that Americans could disagree about fundamental issues while still maintaining the stability of the political system. This period also established many of the precedents and traditions that would characterize American government for generations to come. The cabinet system, the two-term presidency, the role of the Supreme Court in constitutional interpretation, all of these were established during the Federalist era. The Federalist era was also a time of intense foreign policy challenges. The French Revolution and the resulting wars in Europe created difficult choices for the United States. Should it support the French Revolution, which shared many of the ideals of the American Revolution, or should it maintain neutrality to avoid being drawn into European conflicts? The Federalist era showed that the American constitutional system could work, but it also revealed the challenges of governing a diverse and divided nation. The formation of political parties showed that Americans could disagree about fundamental issues while still maintaining the stability of the political system. This period established the foundation for American democracy and showed that the United States could survive and prosper as an independent nation. The peaceful transfer of power in 1800 was a crucial test that the new system passed with flying colors. The Federalist era was the moment when the American experiment in self-government proved that it could work. So when we look at the Federalist era, we can see how the new government faced and overcame its first major challenges. It was a period of intense political conflict, but it was also a period of institutional development and democratic consolidation. The Federalist era showed that the American people were capable of governing themselves and that the constitutional system they had created was up to the task. This period also established many of the patterns and traditions that would characterize American politics for generations to come. The role of the president in foreign policy, the importance of the Supreme Court in constitutional interpretation, all of these were established during the Federalist era and would continue to shape American government and politics for centuries to come. Alright, so now that we understand how the Federalist era established the basic framework of American government, let's talk about what happened when Thomas Jefferson took over and started expanding the nation. Because here's the thing, the presidency of Thomas Jefferson marked a shift in the nation's political direction, emphasizing a smaller central government and an agrarian vision for the republic. Yet paradoxically, Jefferson's tenure was defined by a dramatic expansion of both national territory and federal power. It's like when someone says they're going to declutter their house but ends up buying more stuff. Jefferson was all about small government until he saw a good deal on some real estate. The most significant event of his presidency was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, in a stunning diplomatic development. Napoleon Bonaparte of France offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory, a vast expanse of 827,000 square miles stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, to the United States for $15 million. This was basically the biggest real estate deal ever. Napoleon was basically rage-quitting America and selling everything for a fraction of what it was worth. The acquisition was a strategic triumph, as it doubled the size of the country, secured American control over the vital Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans. However, the purchase posed a constitutional dilemma for Jefferson, a staunch advocate of a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which made no provision for the president to acquire territory. Ultimately, Jefferson rationalized the action as being in the nation's best interest, an exercise of implied powers that set a major precedent for future presidential authority. To explore this vast new domain, Jefferson commissioned the Lewis and Clark Expedition, 1804 to 1806. Led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, the Corps of Discovery ascended the Missouri River, crossed the Rocky Mountains, and reached the Pacific Ocean. This was basically the ultimate road trip vlog, featuring Sacagawea as the real MVP. The expedition was a monumental success, yielding a wealth of scientific and geographic knowledge. The explorers documented hundreds of plant and animal species previously unknown to American science, mapped the new territory, and established diplomatic and trade relations with dozens of Native American tribes. The expedition showed that the United States could explore and understand its vast new territory, and it provided the foundation for future westward expansion. Jefferson's second term was increasingly consumed by foreign policy challenges arising from the Napoleonic Wars between Britain and France. Both powers violated American neutrality, but the British practice of impressment, the seizure of American sailors from U.S. ships for service in the Royal Navy, was particularly galling. In an attempt to use economic pressure to force respect for American rights, Jefferson enacted the Embargo Act of 1807, which prohibited all American ships from leaving for foreign ports. This was basically Jefferson saying, "Fine, no trade for anyone." Cue National Economic Flop era. The embargo proved to be a costly failure. It devastated the American economy, particularly in shipping-dependent New England, far more than it hurt Britain or France, and was widely evaded through smuggling. The embargo showed the limits of economic coercion as a foreign policy tool and demonstrated that the United States was not yet powerful enough to force European powers to respect its rights. The unresolved tensions with Britain eventually led Jefferson's successor, James Madison, to declare war in 1812. The War of 1812 was fought over issues of maritime rights, British support for Native American resistance on the frontier, and a desire among some Americans, war hawks, to conquer Canada. The war was a difficult and often mismanaged conflict that saw the burning of Washington, D.C. by British forces, such as the naval battle on Lake Erie and Andrew Jackson's decisive triumph at the Battle of New Orleans, fought after the peace treaty was signed, fostered a powerful wave of nationalism. The war's aftermath had several key consequences. It confirmed American independence, shattered the strength of Native American resistance east of the Mississippi, which had been discredited by its opposition to the war at the Hartford Convention, marked by political unity under the dominant Democratic-Republican Party and a surge of national pride. Became known as the Era of Good Feelings. This was a time when Americans felt confident about their nation's future and optimistic about the possibilities of westward expansion. The Louisiana Purchase and the War of 1812 were crucial events in the development of American expansionism. The purchase gave the United States control over a vast territory that would become the heartland of the nation, while the war confirmed American independence and removed the last major obstacles to westward expansion. These events also showed how the United States could expand its territory and influence through a combination of diplomacy, purchase, and military force. The Louisiana Purchase was a diplomatic triumph that doubled the size of the nation, while the War of 1812 was a military conflict that confirmed American independence and opened the way for further expansion. The expansion of the United States during this period was not just about acquiring land, it was about creating the space and resources that would allow the nation to grow and prosper. The Louisiana Territory would become the breadbasket of the nation, providing the agricultural resources that would fuel American economic growth in the 19th century. The expansion also created new challenges and opportunities. The presence of Native American tribes in the new territory would create conflicts that would last for generations. The question of whether slavery would be allowed to expand into the new territory would become one of the most divisive issues in American politics. So when we look at Jefferson and expansion, we can see how the United States began to develop its characteristic pattern of growth and expansion. The Louisiana Purchase showed that the nation could acquire territory peacefully through diplomacy and purchase, while the War of 1812 showed that it could defend its interests through military force when necessary. This period established the foundation for the westward expansion that would characterize American history for the rest of the 19th century. The Louisiana Territory would become the gateway to the West, providing the route for millions of Americans to move westward in search of land, opportunity, and a better life. The expansion of the United States during this period was not without controversy or conflict, but it was essential to the nation's development. The Louisiana Purchase and the War of 1812 created the space and security that would allow the United States to grow into the continental power it would become by the end of the 19th century. This period also showed how the United States could balance its desire for expansion with its commitment to Republican government. The Louisiana Purchase was made possible by the strong executive power that Jefferson had previously opposed, showing how the demands of governing a growing nation could sometimes conflict with political principles. So when we talk about Jefferson and expansion, we're really talking about the moment when the United States began to develop its characteristic pattern of growth and expansion. It was a period of dramatic change that would shape the nation's development for generations to come. Alright, so now that we understand how the United States expanded its territory, let's talk about how the economy and society fundamentally changed during the early 19th century. Because here's the thing, the early 19th century witnessed a fundamental transformation of the American economy, a period historians call the Market Revolution. This was not a single event, but a complex process involving a shift from a localized, subsistence-based agrarian economy to an integrated national marketplace driven by industry and commerce. It's like when you upgrade from a flip phone to a smartphone, suddenly everything you thought you knew about communication and productivity gets turned upside down. This revolution reshaped how Americans worked, lived, and related to one another, laying the groundwork for the modern capitalist society. Think of it like when your phone gets a major update and suddenly everything works differently. The market revolution was the 19th century version of that, but for the entire economy. Several key economic developments fueled this transformation. Technological innovation was a primary driver. Eli Whitney's development of interchangeable parts revolutionized manufacturing, allowing for the mass production of goods that had previously been handmade by skilled artisans. This principle, first applied to muskets, soon spread to other industries. It was like discovering the cheat code for manufacturing. Instead of making everything by hand, you could make standardized parts that could be assembled quickly and efficiently. The growth of factories, particularly textile mills in New England, created new centers of production and drew workers from the countryside to burgeoning urban centers. These were basically the original 9-to-5 grind, the first time in American history that large numbers of people worked for wages in centralized locations rather than on their own farms. This industrialization was powered by a concurrent revolution in transportation and communication. The construction of canals, most notably the Erie Canal, and the advent of the steamboat and the railroad, created a national network that linked the agricultural West, the industrializing Northeast, and the cotton-producing South, making it possible to transport goods and crops over long distances cheaply and efficiently. The Erie Canal was like the 19th century version of dropping a new iOS update. Everyone's life suddenly changed. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, connected the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, creating a water route from the Midwest to the Atlantic Ocean. This dramatically reduced the cost of transporting goods and opened up new markets for farmers in the West. Before the canal, it cost more to ship a ton of grain from Buffalo to New York than it did to ship the same grain from New York to London. After the canal, the cost dropped by 90%. The social consequences of the market revolution were profound and often contradictory. The period sparked explosive economic growth and created new personal wealth, but it also widened the gap between the rich and the poor. A new class of wealthy industrialists and capitalists emerged, while a growing class of property-less wage workers became dependent on factory labor for their livelihood. Many of these workers, including women and children, labored for low wages in difficult and often dangerous conditions, becoming trapped in cycles of poverty. The traditional rhythms of farm life were replaced by the disciplined, time-oriented structure of the factory. The revolution also spurred increased urbanization as people flocked to cities in search of employment, leading to overcrowding and the social problems associated with rapid, unplanned growth. While the market revolution improved the standard of living for many by making consumer goods more widely available and affordable, it also created a more impersonal, marked by devastating economic depressions. These panics were like the original recessions. They showed that the new market economy was powerful, but also unstable. The market revolution also had profound effects on American society and culture. The rise of wage labor created new social classes and new forms of social conflict. The growth of cities created new social problems and new opportunities. The development of a national market created new forms of economic interdependence and new sources of political tension. The revolution also created new opportunities for social mobility, at least for some people. The rise of industry and commerce created new ways to make money and new paths to success. But it also created new forms of economic insecurity and new sources of social inequality. The market revolution was not just an economic change, it was a social and cultural revolution that transformed American society from top to bottom. It created new ways of working, new ways of living, and new ways of thinking about the world. It established the foundation for the modern American economy and society. This period also showed how technological change could have far-reaching social and economic consequences. The development of new technologies like the steam engine and the railroad didn't just make things more efficient, they created entirely new ways of organizing economic and social life. The market revolution was a crucial period in American history because it showed how the United States could adapt to and benefit from the changes brought by the Industrial Revolution. While Europe was experiencing its own industrial transformation, the United States was creating a unique version of industrial capitalism that would become one of the defining characteristics of American society. This period also established many of the patterns and institutions that would characterize American capitalism for generations to come. The factory system, the wage labor system, the national market, all of these were established during the market revolution and would continue to shape American economic life for centuries to come. So when we look at the market revolution, we can see how the United States began to develop its characteristic pattern of economic growth and social change. It was a period of dramatic transformation that would shape the nation's development for generations to come. The market revolution was not without its costs and challenges, but it was essential to the nation's development. It created the economic foundation that would allow the United States to become a global economic powerhouse in the 20th century. It also created many of the social and economic problems that would need to be addressed in the decades to come. This period showed how the United States could adapt to and benefit from the changes brought by the Industrial Revolution. While Europe was experiencing its own industrial transformation, the United States was creating a unique version of industrial capitalism that would become one of the defining characteristics of American society. The market revolution was the moment when the United States began to develop its characteristic pattern of economic growth and social change. It was a period of dramatic transformation that would shape the nation's development for generations to come. Alright, so now that we understand how the economy was changing, let's talk about how politics was changing too. Because here's the thing. The social and economic upheavals of the market revolution were mirrored by a dramatic transformation in American politics. The era of good feelings dissolved in the contentious presidential election of 1824, giving way to a new, more populist and participatory political culture known as Jacksonian democracy. This era was characterized by the expansion of suffrage, a belief in a strong executive, and a fervent challenge to what was perceived as entrenched economic and political elites. It's like when your favorite app gets a major update and suddenly everything feels different. American politics was getting a complete makeover. The catalyst for this new political alignment was the election of 1824. In a four-way race, Andrew Jackson won the most popular and electoral votes but failed to secure the required majority in the Electoral College. The election was thrown into the House of Representatives, where Speaker of the House Henry Clay, who had finished fourth, threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. When Adams won and subsequently appointed Clay as his Secretary of State, Jackson's supporters were outraged, denouncing the outcome as a corrupt bargain that had thwarted the will of the people. This was basically the American Idol voting scandal vibes of the 19th century. The accusation fueled popular resentment against the established political order and became the central rallying cry for Jackson's successful presidential campaign in 1828. Jackson's supporters were like, "The system is rigged," and they weren't entirely wrong. Jackson's presidency, 1829-1837, championed the cause of the common man against the forces of aristocracy and privilege. A key feature of this era was the dramatic expansion of political participation. Most states eliminated property qualifications for voting, extending the franchise to virtually all white males. This democratization of politics led to higher voter turnouts and a more boisterous, partisan political culture. Jackson also instituted the spoils system, rewarding his political supporters with government jobs, which he defended as a way to reform government by rotating officials and preventing the emergence of a permanent. This was basically Jackson handing out jobs like Oprah. You get a post office. You get a post office. While the spoils system had some benefits in terms of preventing entrenched bureaucracies, it also created a system where government jobs were awarded based on political loyalty rather than merit. At the heart of Jackson's presidency was his assault on institutions he believed concentrated power and wealth in the hands of a few. The most significant of these conflicts was the Bank War. Jackson viewed the Second Bank of the United States as a corrupt, unconstitutional monopoly that benefited wealthy Eastern elites at the expense of farmers and workers. He vetoed the bill to recharter the bank. He moved to dismantle it by withdrawing federal deposits and placing them in state-chartered pet banks. This was basically Jackson Rage quitting Chase Bank. The destruction of the National Bank contributed to a period of economic instability that culminated in the Panic of 1837. While Jackson's actions were popular with many Americans who distrusted banks and financial institutions, they also contributed to economic instability that would hurt many of the same people he was trying to help. Jackson's presidency also saw a major confrontation over states' rights in the nullification crisis. In response to high federal tariffs that they argued unfairly burdened the agricultural South, South Carolina, led by Jackson's own Vice President, John C. Calhoun, asserted the right of a state to nullify or declare void a federal law within its borders, vehemently rejected this doctrine, declaring that disunion by armed force is treason. He threatened to use military force to enforce the tariff. While Jackson championed the rights of the common white man, his policies were devastating for Native Americans. Driven by a desire to open up land in the Southeast for white settlement and cotton cultivation, Jackson pursued a policy of Indian removal. He signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties to forcibly relocate the Cherokee. This was basically forced relocation, the literal worst side quest ever. Despite a Supreme Court ruling in favor of the Cherokee, known as the Trail of Tears, resulted in the deaths of thousands. The Indian Removal Act was one of the most shameful episodes in American history, showing how the expansion of democracy for white men could come at the expense of other groups. Jackson's presidency also saw the rise of a new form of political campaigning. The 1828 election was the first to feature widespread mudslinging and personal attacks, with both sides engaging in character assassination and rumor-mongering. Jackson was accused of being a bigamist and a murderer, while Adams was portrayed as an elitist who had stolen the presidency through corruption. The rise of Jacksonian democracy also coincided with the development of a new form of political organization. Political parties became more organized and professional, with permanent staffs, regular meetings, and systematic efforts to mobilize voters. The Democratic Party, which emerged from Jackson's supporters, became the first truly national political party in American history. Jackson's presidency also saw the rise of a new form of political rhetoric that emphasized the virtues of the common man and the dangers of aristocracy and privilege. Jackson and his supporters portrayed themselves as defenders of democracy against the forces of corruption and elitism. This rhetoric would become a staple of American politics for generations to come. The Jacksonian era also saw the rise of new forms of political participation and activism. The expansion of suffrage led to higher voter turnouts and more competitive elections. Political parties became more organized and professional, with permanent staffs and systematic efforts to mobilize voters. So when we look at Jacksonian democracy, we can see how American politics was becoming more democratic and participatory, but also more partisan and contentious. The expansion of suffrage was a major step forward for American democracy, but it also created new forms of political conflict and division. This period also showed how American politics could be both democratic and exclusionary at the same time. While white men were gaining more political rights, other groups were losing them or being excluded entirely. The expansion of democracy for some came at the expense of others. The Jacksonian era was a crucial period in the development of American democracy. It showed how the United States could expand political participation while maintaining political stability. It also showed how American politics could become more democratic and participatory while remaining exclusionary and discriminatory. This period established many of the patterns and traditions that would characterize American politics for generations to come. The two-party system, the spoils system, the emphasis on the common man, all of these were established during the Jacksonian era and would continue to shape American political life for centuries to come. So when we talk about Jacksonian democracy, we're really talking about the moment when American politics became more democratic and participatory, but also more partisan and contentious. It was a period of dramatic change that would shape the nation's political development for generations to come. Alright, so now that we understand how politics was changing, let's talk about how society was changing too. Because here's the thing, the Jacksonian era's emphasis on the power of the individual, combined with the social anxieties produced by the market revolution, created fertile ground for a wave of social and moral reform movements, energized by the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening. These movements sought to perfect American society by combating a wide range of perceived evils, from slavery and alcohol consumption to the unequal treatment of women. It's like when you're scrolling through social media and you see everyone suddenly becoming activists for different causes. America was having its own social justice awakening. The Second Great Awakening was a Protestant religious revival that swept the nation in the early 19th century. Unlike the Calvinist determinism of the First Great Awakening, this revival emphasized individual free will, personal salvation through good works. Think of it as revival tents being the Coachella of religion. It was a massive, emotional, transformative experience that brought people together from all walks of life. This optimistic and activist theology inspired countless Americans to dedicate themselves to social reform, viewing it as a moral and religious duty to eradicate sin from society. The revival cut across class and regional lines, creating a shared experience that would help unite the nation. It also led to the rise of new, more democratic Protestant denominations, such as Baptists and Methodists, which emphasized individual choice and personal responsibility. The most significant and radical of these reform movements was abolitionism. The 1830s saw a shift in the anti-slavery movement from a focus on gradual emancipation and colonization to a demand for the immediate and uncompensated abolition of slavery, led by figures like William Lloyd Garrison, who published the influential anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator. The abolitionist movement grew in strength and militancy, becoming a major force in the escalating sectional conflict. These were basically activists dropping hot takes before Twitter existed. The abolitionist movement used every available means to spread its message: newspapers, pamphlets, public lectures, and even direct action. They organized boycotts of slave-produced goods, helped enslaved people escape to freedom, and worked to change public opinion through education and persuasion. The women's rights movement also gained significant momentum during this period, often growing out of women's involvement in the abolitionist cause. Women like Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who were criticized for speaking publicly against slavery, began to argue that women, like enslaved people, were denied their basic rights as citizens. This activism culminated in the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. This was basically the first feminist group chat. The convention issued a Declaration of Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence, which proclaimed that all men and women are created equal, and listed grievances against the disenfranchisement and oppression of women. Most radically, it called for women's suffrage, launching the organized movement for the right to vote. The Seneca Falls Convention was a landmark event in the history of women's rights, showing that women could organize and advocate for their own interests. The longest-lasting and most broad-based reform effort of the era sought to curb the consumption of alcohol, which was seen as a major source of crime. This was basically the original Dry January, but militant. Organizations like the American Temperance Society were formed, and millions of Americans pledged to abstain from alcohol. The movement was particularly strong among women, who often bore the brunt of alcohol-related problems in their families. The temperance movement was successful in reducing alcohol consumption in many parts of the country, and it helped establish the precedent for government regulation of personal behavior. It also showed how reform movements could use moral persuasion and social pressure to achieve their goals. The era also saw the rise of utopian communities, experimental societies that sought to create ideal social and economic arrangements. Communities like Brook Farm, founded by Transcendentalists, and the Oneida community, which practiced complex marriage, attempted to put their radical social theories into practice. These were basically hippie communes before they were cool. These communities were often short-lived, but they showed how Americans were willing to experiment with new forms of social organization. They also provided a testing ground for ideas that would later become more mainstream, such as women's rights, communal living, and alternative forms of education. Other reform movements focused on education, prison reform, and the treatment of the mentally ill. The Common School movement, led by Horace Mann, sought to establish free, public education for all children. The movement was successful in many states, helping to create the foundation for the American public education system. Prison reform movements sought to improve conditions in jails and prisons, which were often overcrowded and inhumane. Reformers like Dorothea Dix worked to improve the treatment of the mentally ill, who were often confined in jails or poorhouses rather than receiving proper medical care. These reform movements were a direct response to the anxieties of the market revolution, energized by the moral fervor of the Second Great Awakening. Abolitionists fought the sin of slavery. Temperance advocates fought the sin of alcohol, all using the new political language of popular sovereignty to demand change and remake American society. The reform movements of the early 19th century showed how Americans could work together to address social problems and improve their society. They demonstrated the power of moral persuasion and social activism, and they established many of the patterns and institutions that would characterize American reform movements for generations to come. These movements also showed how American society could be both conservative and progressive at the same time. While many reformers were motivated by religious conservatism and a desire to return to traditional values, their methods and goals were often quite radical and progressive. The reform movements of the early 19th century were a crucial period in the development of American social activism. They showed how Americans could work together to address social problems and improve their society. They also established many of the patterns and institutions that would characterize American reform movements for generations to come. So when we look at the reform movements of the early 19th century, we can see how American society was becoming more activist and reform-oriented. It was a period of dramatic change that would shape the nation's social development for generations to come. The reform movements showed how the United States could address social problems through voluntary action and moral persuasion. They demonstrated the power of civil society and the importance of individual and collective action in bringing about social change. This period established many of the patterns and traditions that would characterize American social activism for generations to come. The abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement, the temperance movement, all of these would continue to influence American society and politics for centuries to come. So when we talk about the reform movements of the early 19th century, we're really talking about the moment when American society became more activist and reform-oriented. It was a period of dramatic change that would shape the nation's social development for generations to come. Alright, so now that we understand how society was changing, let's talk about how the United States was expanding and what that meant for the nation. Because here's the thing, in the mid-19th century, the ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand its dominion across the North American continent, captured the national imagination. This expansionist fervor led to the annexation of Texas in 1845 and the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848, and it would fundamentally reshape the nation and its politics. It's like when you're playing a video game and you're like, I need to conquer the entire map. America was in full expansion mode. This was basically America in its go big or go home era. The war resulted in a stunning American victory and the acquisition of a vast new territory, which included present-day California. This territorial gain came at a steep price, as it immediately raised the explosive question of whether slavery would be allowed to expand into these new lands. A question that would shatter the fragile political compromises that had held the nation together. For decades, the issue of slavery's expansion had been managed through a series of delicate sectional compromises. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had admitted Missouri to the Union as a slave state and Maine as a free state, while prohibiting slavery in the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory north of the 36-330 Acts parallel. This compromise maintained the balance of power between free and slave states in the Senate for over 30 years. The acquisition of the Mexican Cession upset this balance and led to the Compromise of 1850. This complex package of legislation admitted California as a free state, allowed the territories of Utah and New Mexico to decide the issue of slavery by popular sovereignty, and abolished the slave trade, but not slavery itself, in Washington. Critically, to appease the South, the compromise included a new and much more stringent Fugitive Slave Act. This law was basically forcing Northerners to participate in slavery whether they liked it or not. It required federal officials and citizens in free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves, denying alleged fugitives the right to a jury trial. The act was met with outrage in the North, where it was seen as a moral and legal outrage that forced Northerners to become complicit in the institution of slavery. It led to open defiance, violent confrontations, and the passage of personal liberty laws in several northern states to counteract its effects. The sectional peace bought by the compromise was short-lived. Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois pushed through the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which organized the territories of Kansas and Nebraska and explicitly repealed the Missouri Compromise line, allowing settlers in those territories to decide the slavery issue by popular sovereignty. The act reignited the sectional firestorm. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each side determined to control the territory's political future. This led to widespread fraud, the establishment of rival territorial governments, and a brutal guerrilla war known as Bleeding Kansas. This was basically the Hunger Games of voting, violence, chaos, no rules. The violence in Kansas was a bloody prelude to the Civil War, showing how the slavery issue could tear communities apart and lead to open warfare. The escalating political crisis was mirrored by a cultural one. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel that depicted the brutality and inhumanity of slavery in vivid, emotional terms. The book was an unprecedented bestseller, selling 300,000 copies in its first year in the United States alone. It had a profound impact on public opinion, galvanizing abolitionist sentiment in the North by personalizing the evils of slavery and provoking a furious backlash in the South, where it was condemned as slanderous propaganda. This was basically the viral bestseller that changed the discourse, the 1850s version of dropping a Netflix documentary. The novel brought the moral argument against slavery into the homes of millions and made compromise on the issue increasingly difficult. It showed how popular culture could influence political debate and change public opinion on fundamental issues. The expansion of the United States during this period was not just about acquiring land, it was about defining what kind of nation the United States would become. The question of whether slavery would expand into the new territories was not just a political issue, it was a moral and cultural issue that would define the nation's character and future. The expansion also created new challenges for the American political system. The addition of new states and territories upset the delicate balance between free and slave states, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the political compromises that had held the nation together. The question of slavery's expansion became the central issue in American politics, dividing the nation along sectional lines. The expansion of the United States during this period also had profound implications for Native Americans and Mexicans. The Mexican-American War resulted in the loss of half of Mexico's territory, while the westward expansion of American settlers led to the displacement and destruction of Native American communities across the continent. The expansion also created new opportunities and challenges for American society. The new territories provided land for millions of Americans seeking economic opportunity, while the question of slavery's expansion created new sources of political conflict and division. So when we look at Manifest Destiny and the expansion of the United States, we can see how the nation was growing and changing, but also how this growth was creating new challenges and conflicts. The expansion was not just about acquiring land, it was about defining what kind of nation the United States would become. This period showed how the United States could expand its territory and influence, but it also showed how this expansion could create new sources of conflict and division. The question of slavery's expansion would become the central issue in American politics, leading to the Civil War and the eventual abolition of slavery. The expansion of the United States during this period was a crucial step in the nation's development, but it was also a source of conflict and division that would shape American history for generations to come. The question of what to do with the new territories, and whether slavery would be allowed to expand into them, would become the central issue in American politics. So when we talk about Manifest Destiny and the expansion of the United States, we're really talking about the moment when the nation began to grapple with the consequences of its growth and expansion. It was a period of dramatic change that would shape the nation's development for generations to come. The expansion showed how the United States could grow and prosper, but it also showed how this growth could create new challenges and conflicts. The question of slavery's expansion would become the central issue in American politics, leading to the Civil War and the eventual abolition of slavery. This period established the foundation for the westward expansion that would characterize American history for the rest of the 19th century. The new territories would provide land and opportunity for millions of Americans, while the question of slavery's expansion would create the political divisions that would lead to the Civil War. So when we look at Manifest Destiny and the expansion of the United States, we can see how the nation was growing and changing, but also how this growth was creating new challenges and conflicts. The expansion was not just about acquiring land, it was about defining what kind of nation the United States would become. Alright, so now that we understand how the United States expanded and how the slavery issue became increasingly divisive, let's talk about what happened when the nation finally broke apart. Because here's the thing. The American Civil War, which began with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861, was the most devastating conflict in the nation's history. It was a war fought not against a foreign power, pitting brother against brother in a struggle to determine the future of the Union and the institution of slavery. It's like when your favorite band has a massive breakup and the members start fighting each other instead of making music. At the outset of the war, the Union held significant material advantages. The North had a much larger population, approximately 22 million to the Confederacy's 9 million, of whom 3.5 million were enslaved. A vastly superior industrial capacity with 90% of the nation's factories. A more extensive railroad network. Think of it as the North being a stacked Minecraft server with resources. They had all the advantages. The Confederacy, however, had its own advantages. It was fighting a defensive war on its own territory, which meant it only had to resist being conquered, not conquer the North. It had a strong military tradition that produced a cadre of talented officers. Most notably, Robert E. Lee and its soldiers were highly motivated to defend their homes and way of life. The South was basically fighting on home turf in sweaty try-hard mode. The war was fought on multiple fronts, but several key battles and campaigns proved to be decisive turning points. In the Eastern Theater, the Battle of Antietam in September 1862 was the single bloodiest day in American history. Though tactically a draw, it was a strategic Union victory as it halted Lee's first invasion of the North. This victory gave President Lincoln the political standing to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which went into effect on January 1, declared that all enslaved people in the rebellious states shall be then African American troops unlocked as playable characters. This momentous act transformed the purpose of the war. It was no longer just a struggle to preserve the Union, but also a war to end slavery. This moral cause energized the Union effort, prevented European powers like Britain and France from intervening on behalf of the Confederacy, who would go on to serve with distinction. The Emancipation Proclamation was a crucial turning point in the war, showing that the Union was fighting not just for political unity, but for human freedom. The summer of 1863 marked the war's most critical turning point. In the East, the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1-3, ended Lee's second and final invasion of the North in a decisive Union victory, crippling the Army of Northern Virginia. This was basically Lee's failed boss raid. He tried to take the fight to the north and got absolutely destroyed. Simultaneously, in the West, General Ulysses S. Grant captured the strategic fortress of Vicksburg, Mississippi on July 4 after a lengthy siege. The fall of Vicksburg gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River, splitting the Confederacy in two. Grant's success in the West, characterized by his relentless and strategic approach, led Lincoln to appoint him commander of all Union armies in 1864. Grant implemented a strategy of total war, applying constant pressure on Lee's army in Virginia, while General William T. Sherman conducted his devastating march to the sea through Georgia and the Carolinas, destroying the South's economic resources and will to fight. Sherman's march was basically speed-running destruction, any percent, no mercy. This relentless pressure ultimately proved successful, leading to Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, effectively ending the war. The war had a profound impact on the home front. Both sides resorted to conscription to fill their armies. The Union's industrial economy boomed with war production, while the Confederacy's agrarian economy, crippled by the Union naval blockade and the destruction of its infrastructure, collapsed. Women on both sides took on new roles, managing farms and businesses and working as nurses. The war was a shared national trauma, bringing death and hardship to nearly every American family. The Civil War was not just a military conflict, it was a social and economic revolution that transformed American society from top to bottom. The abolition of slavery, the expansion of federal power, the transformation of the South's economy, all of these were consequences of the war. The war also had profound implications for American democracy and government. The Union victory confirmed that the United States would remain a single nation, but it also established the federal government as supreme over the states. The war showed that the United States could survive a major crisis and emerge stronger and more united. The Civil War also established many of the patterns and institutions that would characterize American society for generations to come. The expansion of federal power, the development of a strong central government, the establishment of civil rights for African Americans, all of these were consequences of the war. The war also showed how the United States could overcome its greatest challenges and emerge stronger and more united. The abolition of slavery was a major step forward for American democracy, even though the struggle for racial equality would continue for generations to come. So when we look at the Civil War, we can see how the United States faced and overcame its greatest crisis. It was a period of intense conflict and suffering, but it was also a period of transformation and progress. The war showed that the United States could survive and prosper as a single nation, and it established the foundation for the modern United States. The Civil War was the moment when the United States became a truly united nation, but it was also the moment when the nation began to grapple with the challenges of Reconstruction and the integration of African Americans into American society. The war was just the beginning of a much longer and more complex process of nation building and social change. This period showed how the United States could overcome its greatest challenges and emerge stronger and more united. The abolition of slavery was a major step forward for American democracy, even though the struggle for racial equality would continue for generations to come. The Civil War established many of the patterns and institutions that would characterize American society for generations to come. The expansion of federal power, the development of a strong central government, the establishment of civil rights for African Americans, all of these were consequences of the war. So when we talk about the Civil War, we're really talking about the moment when the United States faced and overcame its greatest crisis. It was a period of intense conflict and suffering, but it was also a period of transformation and progress. The war showed that the United States could survive and prosper as a single nation, and it established the foundation for the modern United States. The Civil War was the moment when the United States became a truly united nation, but it was also the moment when the nation began to grapple with the challenges of Reconstruction and the integration of African Americans into American society. The war was just the beginning of a much longer and more complex process of nation building and social change. This period showed how the United States could overcome its greatest challenges and emerge stronger and more united. The abolition of slavery was a major step forward for American democracy, even though the struggle for racial equality would continue for generations to come. The Civil War established many of the patterns and institutions that would characterize American society for generations to come. The expansion of federal power, the development of a strong central government, the establishment of civil rights for African Americans, all of these were consequences of the war. So when we talk about the Civil War, we're really talking about the moment when the United States faced and overcame its greatest crisis. It was a period of intense conflict and suffering, but it was also a period of transformation and progress. The war showed that the United States could survive and prosper as a single nation, and it established the foundation for the modern United States. Alright, so now that we understand how the Civil War ended, let's talk about what happened next. Because here's the thing, the period following the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, was a tumultuous and ultimately tragic era, dedicated to rebuilding the South, reintegrating the former Confederate states into the Union. It's like when you finally beat the final boss in a video game, but then realize there's a whole new level that's even harder. The initial phase, known as Presidential Reconstruction, 1865 to 1867, was guided by the lenient policies of Presidents Abraham Lincoln and, after his assassination, Andrew Johnson. Their primary goal was the swift restoration of the Union. Johnson's plan offered pardons to most white Southerners who took an oath of loyalty, restored their property except for enslaved people. New all-white Southern governments were quickly formed, which proceeded to pass restrictive black codes designed to control the labor and behavior of African Americans, effectively returning them to a state of quasi-slavery. This leniency and the enactment of the black codes outraged many in the North, particularly the radical Republicans in Congress. Led by figures like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, the Radicals believed that presidential reconstruction was a betrayal of the war's purpose. They sought to punish the former Confederacy, transform Southern society, and, most importantly, secure full civil and political rights for African Americans. In 1866, the Radicals gained control of Congress and launched their own program, known as Radical or Congressional Reconstruction, over President Johnson's vetoes. They passed landmark legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1866, and the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, which divided the South into 5 military districts and required the states to ratify new constitutions that guaranteed voting rights for all men. Radical Reconstruction had several significant successes. The most enduring were the ratification of 3 constitutional amendments, The 13th Amendment, 1865, which granted citizenship to all persons born in the United States and guaranteed them equal protection of the laws, which prohibited the denial of the right to vote based on race. Another major success was the Freedmen's Bureau, a federal agency that provided essential aid to millions of former slaves and poor whites. This was basically the government trying to be Duolingo plus LinkedIn, plus Uber Eats all at once. They were providing education, job training, and basic necessities to millions of people who had been denied these things for generations. These changes brought about an unprecedented experiment in interracial democracy, as African American men voted in large numbers and were elected to offices at all levels of government. However, despite these gains, Reconstruction ultimately failed. A primary reason was its failure to provide economic independence for the formerly enslaved. Plans for widespread land redistribution were abandoned, forcing most freed people into a system of sharecropping, where they farmed land owned by whites in exchange for a share of the crop. This system often trapped them in a cycle of debt and economic dependency that was little better than slavery. The most significant cause of failure, however, was a violent and successful counter-revolution waged by white Southerners committed to restoring white supremacy. Most notably, the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, emerged as the paramilitary arm of the Democratic Party. The KKK were basically terrorist griefers ruining the server. The federal government's response to this insurgency, though initially forceful with the passage of the Enforcement Acts, eventually waned as Northern resolve faded in the face of economic depression and a growing desire for national reconciliation. The end of Reconstruction came with the Compromise of 1877. To resolve the disputed presidential election of 1876, Republican and Democratic leaders struck a deal. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes would become president, and in return he would withdraw the last federal troops from the South. The withdrawal of these troops marked the abandonment of the federal government's commitment to protecting the rights of African Americans, leaving them to the mercy of the white Redeemer governments that quickly dismantled the reforms of the era. This was basically the North saying we're tired, and the South saying GG easy, end of Reconstruction. The failure of Reconstruction was not due to the inability of African Americans to participate in democracy, ushering in the long and brutal era of Jim Crow. So, when we look at Reconstruction, we can see how the United States attempted to address the challenges of integrating African Americans into American society and rebuilding the South after the Civil War. It was a period of great promise and achievement, but also of ultimate failure and betrayal. The Reconstruction era showed how the United States could make progress on issues of civil rights and racial equality, but it also showed how that progress could be reversed through violence and political compromise. The failure of Reconstruction would have profound consequences for American society and race relations for generations to come. This period established many of the patterns and institutions that would characterize American race relations for generations to come. The Jim Crow system, the disenfranchisement of African Americans, the rise of white supremacy, all of these were consequences of the failure of Reconstruction. So, when we talk about Reconstruction, we're really talking about the moment when the United States had the opportunity to create a more just and equal society, but ultimately failed to do so. It was a period of great promise and achievement, but also of ultimate failure and betrayal. Alright, so now that we understand how Reconstruction ended, let's talk about how the United States became an industrial powerhouse. Because, here's the thing, in the decades following the Civil War, the United States underwent an unprecedented industrial transformation, emerging as a global economic powerhouse. Famously dubbed the Gilded Age by Mark Twain, and let me tell you, was characterized by rapid economic growth. The era was defined by a new class of industrialists whose methods and impact generated a fierce debate, casting them as both visionary captains of industry, who built the modern American economy, and ruthless robber barons, who amassed fortunes through exploitation and corruption. It really depended on whether you're the one getting robbed or the one doing the robbing. The railroad was the engine of this industrial revolution. Aided by massive government land grants and subsidies, railroad networks expanded across the continent, linking raw materials to factories and factories to a new national market. Think of railroads as the OG internet, connecting everything and making some people filthy rich. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had built an empire in shipping, shifted his focus to railroads in the 1860s through ruthless competition and consolidation, creating one of the first giant corporations in American history and helping to make railroad transportation more efficient. The railroads, in turn, fueled a massive demand for steel, the essential material for tracks, bridges, and the new skyscrapers that began to define the urban landscape. Andrew Carnegie, a Scottish immigrant who rose from poverty, came to dominate the steel industry. He did so by embracing technological innovation, most notably the Bessemer process for mass-producing steel cheaply, and by pioneering a business model known as vertical integration. Carnegie was basically the vertical integration king, like owning the whole supply chain from mine to store. He controlled every stage of the production process, from the iron ore and coal mines to the steel mills and the transportation networks that brought the final product to market. This model maximized efficiency and allowed him to drive down costs and undersell all competitors. The oil industry experienced a similar consolidation under John D. Rockefeller. Recognizing the growing demand for kerosene for lighting, Rockefeller established the Standard Oil Company in 1870. He achieved a near-total monopoly on the oil refining business through a strategy of horizontal integration, buying out or driving his competitors out of business. Rockefeller was basically the horizontal integration master, buying out everyone until he owned 90% of the oil game. He used predatory pricing, secured secret, preferential rates from railroads to undercut his rivals, and created a new form of corporate organization known as the Trust, a legal structure that allowed Standard Oil to control dozens of formerly competing companies as a single entity. The prevailing economic ideologies of the era provided justification for this unprecedented concentration of wealth. Laissez-faire capitalism held that the government should not interfere in the free market. This was complemented by the social theory of social Darwinism, which applied Charles Darwin's concept of survival of the fittest to human society, arguing that the success of industrial titans was a product of natural superiority and that government intervention to help the poor or regulate business would interfere with this natural process. While these men created vast industrial enterprises that modernized the nation, their success was often built on the exploitation of workers. The industrial boom of the Gilded Age was inextricably linked to two other defining transformations: the rapid growth of cities and a massive wave of immigration. The factory system created a concentrated demand for labor, pulling millions of people from rural America and from around the world into burgeoning urban centers. This influx of people reshaped the nation's demographic and social fabric, creating a new, diverse, and often volatile urban landscape. Between 1870 and 1900, the urban population of the United States tripled. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia became magnets for job seekers, their skylines transformed by steel-frame skyscrapers and their streets crowded with newcomers. This explosive growth, however, far outpaced the capacity of urban infrastructure. Many city dwellers, particularly the working poor and new immigrants, lived in squalid conditions. They were packed into overcrowded tenements, low-rise apartment buildings with inadequate plumbing, ventilation, and sanitation, where disease spread rapidly. These were basically the OG micro-apartments, but somehow worse than anything on HGTV. A significant portion of this new urban population was composed of immigrants. The Gilded Age witnessed a dramatic shift in the sources of immigration. While earlier waves had come primarily from Northern and Western Europe, Germany, the so-called new immigrants of the late 19th century arrived predominantly from Southern and Eastern Europe. These newcomers were often culturally and religiously different from the majority of Americans. Many were Catholic, Jewish, or Eastern Orthodox, and few spoke English. They arrived with little money or education and took unskilled jobs in factories and mines for low wages. To cope with the challenges of a new country, they often settled in ethnic enclaves within the cities, such as Little Italy or Jewish ghettos, where they could preserve their languages. This wave of new immigration provoked a backlash from some native-born Americans. This nativist sentiment was fueled by a combination of economic anxiety, religious prejudice, and racial theories that deemed the new immigrants inferior to those from Northern Europe. Labor unions feared that immigrants would drive down wages, while Protestant leaders were alarmed by the growing number of Catholics and Jews. This hostility led to calls for immigration restriction. The most severe manifestation of this was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred all Chinese laborers from entering the country, marking the first time the United States had restricted immigration based on nationality. This was basically America's first, we're full moment, but racist. The Gilded Age city was a place of stark contrasts. It was a landscape of innovation and opportunity, but also one of extreme poverty and social division. The lavish mansions of industrialists stood just miles from the cramped and unsanitary tenements of the workers whose labor built their fortunes. This immense disparity between the wealthy elite and the impoverished working class created a society rife with tension and conflict, challenging the American ideal of an egalitarian republic. The Gilded Age was a crucial period in American history because it showed how the United States could adapt to and benefit from the changes brought by the Industrial Revolution, while Europe was experiencing its own industrial transformation. The United States was creating a unique version of industrial capitalism that would become one of the defining characteristics of American society. This period also established many of the patterns and institutions that would characterize American capitalism for generations to come. The factory system, the wage labor system, the national market, all of these were established during the Gilded Age and would continue to shape American economic life for centuries to come. So when we look at the Gilded Age, we can see how the United States began to develop its characteristic pattern of economic growth and social change. It was a period of dramatic transformation that would shape the nation's development for generations to come. The Gilded Age was not without its costs and challenges, but it was essential to the nation's development. It created the economic foundation that would allow the United States to become a global economic powerhouse in the 20th century. This period showed how the United States could adapt to and benefit from the changes brought by the Industrial Revolution. While Europe was experiencing its own industrial transformation, the United States was creating a unique version of industrial capitalism that would become one of the defining characteristics of American society. The Gilded Age was the moment when the United States began to develop its characteristic pattern of economic growth and social change. It was a period of dramatic transformation that would shape the nation's development for generations to come. Alright, so now that we've seen how the industrial economy developed and made a bunch of people filthy rich, let's talk about how the workers who were actually doing all the heavy lifting responded to these new conditions. Because here's the tea, the immense wealth and productivity of the Gilded Age were built on the backs of an industrial working class that was getting absolutely destroyed. The logic of industrial capitalism, driven by this relentless pursuit of efficiency and profit, treated labor as just another commodity to be purchased as cheaply as possible. It's like when you're playing a video game and you're just trying to get the most resources for the least amount of effort, except in this case, the resources were actual human beings. Life for the industrial worker was precarious and harsh. The average workday was 10 to 12 hours long, 6 days a week, for wages that often hovered near the poverty line. These were basically the original gig economy workers, but with worse pay and no app to complain on. Workplaces, from steel mills and coal mines to textile factories and meatpacking plants, were notoriously dangerous, with little regard for safety. It's like if your job was to play Russian roulette every day, but instead of a bullet, you might get crushed by machinery or burned by molten metal. In response to these absolutely terrible conditions, workers began to organize into labor unions to collectively bargain for better treatment. One of the earliest and most significant national unions was the Knights of Labor. Founded in 1869, the Knights were unique in their inclusivity, welcoming skilled and unskilled workers, women, and African Americans. Think of them as the inclusive union that welcomed everyone, like a really progressive Discord server where everyone could join and have a voice. They pursued a broad reform agenda, advocating for an 8-hour workday. Imagine that, asking to work less than 12 hours. An end to child labor, because apparently that was a thing people needed to be convinced about. In contrast, the American Federation of Labor, AFL, founded in 1886 and led by Samuel Gompers, was more conservative. The AFL was a federation of craft unions, focusing on skilled white male workers. It was basically the exclusive union that only wanted skilled workers, like a private club that wouldn't let you in unless you had the right credentials. The conflict between labor and capital frequently erupted into open warfare, with the government and courts consistently siding with employers. It's like if you were playing a game where the referee was clearly biased toward one team. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877, the nation's first major nationwide strike, was sparked by wage cuts and paralyzed rail traffic across the country. It was violently suppressed by state militias and federal troops, leaving more than 100 people dead. Talk about overkill. People were just asking for fair pay, and the government was like, let's send in the military. The Haymarket Riot of 1886 began as a peaceful rally in Chicago for an 8-hour day, when a bomb was thrown at police, and we still don't know who actually threw it. The ensuing violence and the subsequent trial and execution of anarchist leaders created a powerful backlash against the labor movement, which was falsely associated with radicalism and violence. This event contributed to the rapid decline of the Knights of Labor. It's like if one person at a peaceful protest did something bad, and then everyone at the protest got blamed for it. The Homestead Strike of 1892 at one of Andrew Carnegie's steel mills involved a pitched battle between striking workers and hired Pinkerton private security guards, basically mercenaries, which was ultimately broken by the state militia, crushing the powerful steelworkers union. It's like if you were having a disagreement with your boss and they hired a bunch of private security to beat you up, and then the police showed up and arrested you for defending yourself. Finally, the Pullman Strike of 1894, a nationwide railroad boycott led by Eugene V. Debs and the American Railway Union, was crushed when President Grover Cleveland sent in federal troops. These events demonstrated the immense power of corporations and the government's willingness to use force to defeat organized labor. ensuring that the struggle for workers' rights would be a long and arduous one. The labor movement would continue to face challenges throughout the 20th century, but the struggles of the Gilded Age established many of the patterns and institutions that would characterize American labor relations for generations to come. It's like they were writing the playbook for how to fight for workers' rights, even though they were losing most of the battles. So when we look at the labor struggles of the Gilded Age, we're seeing how American workers responded to the challenges of industrial capitalism. It was a period of intense conflict and struggle, but it also established many of the patterns and institutions that would characterize American labor relations for generations to come. These workers were basically the original activists, fighting for rights that we take for granted today, like not working 12-hour shifts or having basic safety standards at work. The labor struggles of the Gilded Age were brutal and often unsuccessful, but they laid the groundwork for the labor rights we have today. It's like when you're playing a really hard level in a video game, you might die a lot, but each attempt teaches you something that helps you eventually beat it. Alright, so now that we've seen how workers were getting absolutely destroyed by the Gilded Age, let's talk about how the political system was handling all this chaos. Because here's the tea. The politics of this era were basically a mess that reflected all the dramatic economic and social changes happening around the country. So picture this. You've got high voter turnout and intense partisan loyalty. People were really into their political parties back then, but also political stalemate, widespread corruption, and a growing sense of frustration among regular Americans who felt like they were getting left behind by this new industrial order. It's like when you're playing a team game and your teammates are all arguing about strategy while the other team is scoring points. At the local level, many big cities were controlled by these powerful political machines. Think of them as the original social media algorithms, but for politics. The most famous one was New York City's Tammany Hall, led by William Boss Tweed. These guys are basically like, give people what they need. Get their votes. They provided essential services to immigrant communities like jobs. Now, here's where it gets sketchy. While they were offering a form of social welfare, which sounds nice, they were doing it through rampant corruption. They were enriching party bosses and their allies through kickbacks and fraudulent contracts. It's like if your school's student government was promising to fix the cafeteria, but was actually just pocketing the money and serving you mystery meat. The corruption wasn't just local either, it was happening at the federal level too. President Ulysses S. Grant's administration was absolutely plagued by scandals. There was the Credit Mobilier scandal, which involved bribes to congressmen to protect a fraudulent railroad construction company, basically paying off politicians to look the other way while they scammed everyone. Then there was the Whiskey Ring, which was a scheme by distillers and public officials to defraud the government of millions in liquor taxes. It's like if the IRS was in on a scheme to help people avoid paying taxes on their alcohol. All this corruption finally sparked a movement for civil service reform. The federal government had been operating on what they called the spoils system, basically. When a political party won an election, they would give government jobs to their loyal supporters, regardless of whether they were actually qualified for the job. It's like if you won student body president and immediately gave all your friends jobs in the school administration, even if they had no idea what they were doing. Reformers were like this. System is leading to incompetence and corruption, and started advocating for a merit-based system where people would actually have to prove they could do the job. The movement gained some serious momentum in 1881 when President James A. Garfield was assassinated by a disgruntled office seeker, someone who was mad they didn't get a government job. Talk about taking rejection badly. The public outcry following his death led Congress to pass the Pendleton Act of 1883, which was basically when America finally decided government jobs should go to qualified people, not just friends. This landmark legislation established a bipartisan civil service commission and created a system where federal jobs would be awarded based on competitive exams rather than political connections. While the act initially only covered a small percentage of federal jobs, it laid the foundation for a professional, merit-based civil service. Now, the central economic debate in national politics during this period was the tariff issue. The Republican Party, which was dominant for much of the era, consistently advocated for high protective tariffs on imported goods. They were basically like, we need to protect America's new industries from foreign competition and keep wages high for American workers. It's like putting up a wall around your local businesses to keep out the competition. We're arguing that high tariffs hurt consumers by raising prices and harm farmers by provoking retaliatory tariffs from other countries, which made it harder to sell American agricultural products abroad. It's like if you started charging your neighbor money to use your driveway, and then they started charging you money to use their driveway, and suddenly nobody can go anywhere. The tariff generated huge revenues for the federal government, leading to decades of budget surpluses. This sense of agrarian grievance, farmers being mad about the economy, would give rise to the most significant challenge to the two-party system in the late 19th century, the populist movement. So when we look at the politics and reform of the Gilded Age, we're seeing how the American political system was responding to the challenges of industrialization and urbanization. It was a period of corruption and reform, of political stalemate and social change. The reforms of this era would establish many of the patterns and institutions that would characterize American government for generations to come. The politics of the Gilded Age were basically a mess, but they were a mess that eventually led to some important reforms. It's like when your room gets so messy that you finally have to clean it up. Sometimes you need to hit rock bottom before you start making positive changes. Alright, so here's where things get wild. After all that Gilded Age drama with the robber barons living their best life while everyone else was struggling, American farmers finally said, enough is enough, and decided to start their own political movement. This is the story of how regular people tried to fight back against what they saw as a rigged system. So picture this, you're a farmer in the 1890s, and you're basically living through the original "this economy is rigged" moment. The railroads are charging you insane fees to ship your stuff. We only use gold money now, which makes it impossible to pay off your debts. It's like trying to play a video game where the difficulty keeps getting cranked up, but you're still stuck with the starter equipment. Enter the populist movement, the most significant challenge to the two-party system in the late 19th century. These farmers, particularly in the West and South, were basically like, we're not going to take this anymore, and started organizing into what they called farmers' alliances. Think of it as the original Discord server for people who were tired of getting screwed over by the system. In the early 1890s, they took it to the next level and formed the People's Party, or, as everyone called it, the Populist Party. And let me tell you, their platform was absolutely wild by 1890 standards. They were calling for government ownership of railroads, basically nationalizing the companies that were bleeding them dry. A graduated income tax, so the rich actually had to pay their fair share. Direct election of senators, because the current system was giving too much power to political machines. The free and unlimited coinage of silver. Now, the silver thing needs some explaining because it sounds weird today. See, the government had switched to the gold standard, which limited the money supply and made everything more expensive. The populists were like, hey, what if we also use silver to make coins? That would increase the money supply and make it easier for people to borrow money and pay off their debts. It's like they were trying to fix inflation before inflation was even a thing people talked about. The populist movement wasn't just about economics, though. They were also pushing for some serious political reforms that would make America more democratic. They wanted the direct election of senators instead of state legislatures picking them, initiative and referendum, so citizens could propose and vote on laws directly, which is just asking for intimidation. Here's where it gets interesting. The Populist Party actually achieved some real success in the early 1890s. In 1892, their presidential candidate, James B. Weaver, won over 1 million votes and carried 4 states. That's not nothing. It's like a third-party candidate today actually winning electoral votes. It would be absolutely wild. But here's the plot twist. The populist movement started declining in the late 1890s, not because their ideas were bad, but because the major parties started stealing their best material. The Democratic Party in particular was like, hey, these populist ideas are actually pretty popular with voters, and started embracing things like the free coinage of silver. It's like when a big company sees a startup doing something cool and just copies it instead of buying them out. The real legacy of the populist movement isn't just what they accomplished in the 1890s, but how they changed American politics forever. Many of the reforms they were pushing for, like direct election of senators, initiative and referendum, and the secret ballot, eventually became part of the American political system. They basically wrote the playbook for how to challenge the two-party system from the outside. The populist movement showed Americans that they could organize and fight for their interests outside of the traditional political parties. It was like the original grassroots movement, proving that regular people could band together and actually make the government listen to them. While the Populist Party itself was short-lived, their ideas and influence would continue to shape American politics for decades to come. So when we look at the populist movement, we're seeing the birth of modern American political activism. It was a period of intense political energy and social change, but it also established many of the patterns and institutions that would characterize American politics for generations to come. These farmers weren't just complaining about their problems, they were building the tools and strategies that future reformers would use to make America more democratic and fair. The populist movement is basically the story of how Americans learned to work together to address their economic and political concerns. It demonstrated the power of grassroots organizing and the importance of addressing the needs of ordinary citizens, while the Populist Party itself didn't last long. Its ideas and influence would continue to shape American politics for decades to come. proving that sometimes the most important political movements are the ones that change the conversation, even if they don't win every election. Alright, so we've covered a lot of ground here. From the moment Europeans first showed up on these shores to the point where America became this massive industrial powerhouse. We've seen how the United States developed from 13 little colonies into one of the most powerful nations in the world. It's been quite the journey, and honestly, America's character development arc has been absolutely wild. Let's recap what we've learned, because this is some seriously important stuff. We started with the pre-Columbian Americas, where sophisticated societies had been thriving for thousands of years before Columbus even got lost and ended up here. These weren't some primitive wilderness. They were complex civilizations with trade networks, agricultural systems, and cultural traditions that would influence everything that came after. Then we talked about why Europeans showed up in the first place, the classic trio of God, gold, and glory, whether it was spreading Christianity like a viral TikTok challenge, going on the ultimate IRL treasure hunt like Mr. Beast, but bloodier. European nations had big plans for the New World. The Columbian Exchange was basically the world's most chaotic DoorDash order. Europe delivered disease, took gold, and left pigs everywhere. But it also created the first truly global system, connecting the Old World and New World in ways that would shape human history forever. We covered the different models of colonization, the Spanish being the villain DLC with conquest and forced labor, the French and Dutch as collab YouTubers who needed native allies for the fur trade, pushing everyone off the block. The colonial regions developed their own unique characteristics, New England with its no fun allowed, Puritan communities. The middle colonies diverse like a high school cafeteria where every squad had a table. The Enlightenment and Great Awakening created the intellectual and spiritual foundation for revolution, with colonial leaders in their STEM major era and everyone else in their hype church concert era. The period of salutary neglect allowed the colonies to develop their own political institutions and sense of identity. When Britain tried to reassert control after the French and Indian War, it created a crisis that led to revolution. The road to independence was paved with British missteps and colonial resistance, from the Stamp Act being like paying for memes with watermarks but mandatory, to the Boston Tea Party as the ultimate petty rage, quit. The war for independence was more than just a military conflict. It was a revolution in political thought that would inspire people around the world. From the opening boss fight at Lexington and Concord to the clutch win at Saratoga that unlocked the France DLC, to the final raid boss at Yorktown with France's Navy as the OP support character. The new government experiments showed how the United States could learn from its mistakes. The Articles of Confederation were like the trial version with no premium features, leading to Shays' Rebellion, where farmers basically said, "This update sucks. Uninstall." The Constitutional Convention created a framework that balanced the need for strong government with the fear of tyranny. The Federalist era established the foundation of American democracy, with Washington setting precedents and Hamilton being the finance bro-dropping mixtape-length essays. The formation of political parties showed that Americans could disagree about fundamental issues while maintaining political stability. Jefferson's presidency saw dramatic expansion with the Louisiana Purchase, the biggest real estate deal ever, where Napoleon basically rage-quit America. The Lewis and Clark expedition was the ultimate road trip vlog featuring Sacagawea as the real MVP. The market revolution transformed the American economy from a localized, subsistence-based system to an integrated national marketplace. Factories became the original 9-to-5 grind, while the Erie Canal was like dropping a new iOS update that changed everyone's life. Jacksonian democracy expanded political participation, but also created new forms of conflict. The spoils system was like Jackson handing out jobs like Oprah, while the bank war saw him rage. Quit Chase Bank. Indian removal was the literal worst side quest ever. The reform movements of the early 19th century showed how Americans could work together to address social problems. The Second Great Awakening was like revival tents being the Coachella of religion, while abolitionists were dropping hot takes before Twitter existed. Manifest Destiny captured the national imagination as America entered its go big or go home era. The Mexican-American War and the acquisition of new territories raised the explosive question of slavery's expansion, leading to the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act that basically forced Northerners to participate in slavery. The political system collapsed as the slavery issue became increasingly divisive. The Kansas-Nebraska Act led to Bleeding Kansas, the Hunger Games of voting with violence, chaos, and no rules. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the viral bestseller that changed the discourse, the 1850s version of dropping a Netflix documentary. The Civil War was the nation's greatest crisis, pitting brother against brother in a struggle over the future of the Union and slavery. The North had the advantages of a stacked Minecraft server with resources, while the South was fighting on home turf in sweaty try-hard mode. The Emancipation Proclamation was like patch notes, slavery banned in rebel states, African American troops unlocked as playable characters. Reconstruction was a period of great promise and achievement, but also of ultimate failure and betrayal. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were the Equality Trilogy, but with buggy implementation. The Freedmen's Bureau was like the government trying to be Duolingo plus LinkedIn plus Uber Eats all at once. The KKK were terrorist griefers ruining the server, with railroads as the OG internet connecting everything and making some people filthy rich. Carnegie was the vertical integration king, Rockefeller the horizontal integration master, and the era created both great wealth and great inequality. So what does all of this mean? From God, gold, and glory to industrial revolution and populism, this is America's messy character development arc. If A+ was a Netflix binge, we just finished the rags to riches season. Next up, progressivism, world wars, and the American century drama. The United States didn't just magically become the nation it is today. It was built through a series of choices, compromises, conflicts, and transformations that shaped every aspect of American society. Understanding this history is crucial for understanding not just where we've been, but where we might be going. This isn't just a story about the past, it's a story about how nations develop, how societies change, and how people work together, and sometimes against each other, to build something new. The American experiment in self-government wasn't guaranteed to succeed, but through a combination of luck, skill, and determination, it did. So when you think about American history, remember that it's not just a series of dates and names to memorize. It's a story about people making choices, facing challenges, and building something that would change the world. And that story is still being written today.